It had been only a few months since the funeral, yet the air inside Baton Rouge still carried a weight that felt impossible to shake. Jimmy Swaggart's passing had left a vacuum in the ministry, not just in leadership, but in spirit. For decades people had grown accustomed to seeing him on that pulpit, voice trembling with conviction, piano keys under his hands, eyes wet with emotion. Now, every Sunday morning felt a little incomplete. Frances Swaggart kept her composure as she always had. She was the unmovable pillar, the calm in every storm. She didn't say much publicly after Jimmy's death, but those close to her knew she was watching everything, noting every conversation, every whisper in the corridors of the family worship center. She wasn't one for speculation, but she wasn't one to ignore it either. Then came the murmurs. At first, it was just online chatter. A few social media posts from faceless accounts, vague references in YouTube comments. Private Facebook groups where ex-members and longtime critics of the ministry would dissect every move the Swaggart family made. But then the whispers grew bolder. They began naming names. And one name kept coming up alongside Donnie's, Paula White. For those who followed American televangelism, Paula White was not just any preacher. She was a high-profile figure, a woman whose ministry had touched politics, celebrity culture, and the world of prosperity preaching. She had her share of controversies over the years, but nothing had ever stuck long enough to derail her career. To suddenly see her name linked to Donnie Swaggart was, for many, a jolt. No one was saying anything concrete, of course. Just sources claiming there had been friendly interactions between the two that went beyond ministry cooperation. Some dismissed it immediately. Others weren't so quick. The Swaggart name had been through enough scandals over the decades for people to believe that anything was possible. Still, inside JSM, the official position was silence. Donnie went about his preaching schedule, taping shows for SBN, hosting Message of the Cross and Francis and Friends as usual. Francis kept her public comments focused on scripture and ministry updates. Gabriel stayed quiet. It might have all fizzled out, if not for the tape. No one knew exactly when it had been recorded. Some claimed it dated back over a year. Others insisted it was recent. What was certain was that a short audio clip had surfaced in a private group chat of former church members, and by the time anyone could contain it, the file had been shared far beyond that circle. The tape wasn't explosive in the tabloid sense. There was no shouting, no explicit confessions. It was a conversation, low, casual, but intimate in tone. Two voices, one male, unmistakably Donnie's. The other, a woman whose cadence and accent matched Paula White's almost perfectly. They weren't talking about theology. They weren't planning a service. They were talking about meetings, spending more time together, and how good last night was. It wasn't enough to prove wrongdoing, but it was enough to raise eyebrows. By the third day, ministry staff couldn't pretend it wasn't real. People were talking in the hallways, not just online. Questions were landing in the inboxes of SBN producers, and even the prayer lines were getting calls asking about the tape. Frances, as always, did not rush. She had learned decades ago that sometimes silence spoke louder than a hasty denial, but she also knew Donnie, her son, couldn't avoid addressing it forever. Behind the scenes, a private meeting was arranged. Frances, Donnie, a few trusted advisors, and two senior pastors from the family worship center. The mood was tense. Donnie sat with his arms crossed, a defensive set to his jaw. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice flat. "It's just people trying to stir up trouble." Frances didn't respond immediately. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then, quietly, "It doesn't matter if it's ridiculous, Donnie. People are asking questions, and if you don't answer them, they'll invent the answers for you." The room was silent for a long moment. Donnie hated being cornered. Ever since his earliest days in the ministry, he'd been a man who preferred to push forward, not explain himself. But this was different. This was post-Jimmy. The family's reputation was already under a microscope, and one wrong move could fracture what remained of their unity. Finally, Donnie exhaled sharply. "Fine, I'll say something." What followed over the next 48 hours was a carefully planned, strategically timed response. Not a press conference that would only feed the fire. Not a vague post on social media that could be twisted into anything. Instead, Donnie would address it head-on during one of his regular broadcasts. The thinking was simple. By folding the statement into his preaching, he could control the tone and frame it as a moment of clarity, not defensiveness. The morning of the broadcast, the studio was unusually quiet. Crew members moved with deliberate efficiency. Frances sat in the front row, hands folded, eyes fixed on the pulpit. She had said nothing publicly, but her presence alone sent a message. She was watching, she was listening, and she was expecting her son to carry the weight of his own words. When the cameras rolled, Donnie opened with scripture. He read from Proverbs about integrity and the keeping of one's name. For 20 minutes he preached on honesty, trust, and the way the enemy sows discord among believers. And then, without raising his voice, he shifted. "There have been things said about me in recent days," he began, looking directly into the camera. "Things based on a recording that has been passed around, taken out of context, and used to question my character. I want to be clear, I have nothing to hide. The person I was speaking to is a friend and a fellow minister. Our conversations are private, yes, but they have never crossed the line of propriety or morality. To suggest otherwise is to bear false witness, and I won't allow that to stand unchallenged." He didn't say Paula White's name, he didn't acknowledge the rumors explicitly, but he gave enough for his supporters to rally behind, and enough for his critics to keep speculating. When the broadcast ended, Frances didn't move for a moment. Then, slowly she rose, walked to her son, and put a hand on his shoulder. "You did what needed to be done," she said simply. But as they left the studio, both of them knew this wasn't over. The tape was still out there, the questions were still being asked, and the truth, whatever it truly was, had a way of resurfacing when you least expected it. In the weeks that followed, the ministry tightened its internal operations. Staff were reminded about confidentiality. Security on recordings, both audio and video, was reviewed. A few longtime employees quietly resigned, citing personal reasons. Paula White never commented publicly. Her ministry carried on as usual. But in private circles, especially among those who had once been close to JSM, the whispers persisted. Not necessarily about a scandal, but about the alliances, the conversations, and the ways in which powerful ministries sometimes intersected in ways the public never saw. For Donnie, the matter was officially addressed. Unofficially, he remained more guarded than ever, careful with who he spoke to, and always aware that in the world he lived in, even the smallest word, the faintest recording, could force him into the spotlight in a way he never wanted again. In the days after Donnie's broadcast, a strange quiet settled over the ministry. For the average viewer of Sun Life Broadcasting Network, nothing seemed different. The same familiar voices, the same songs, the same panel discussions. But for those working inside the walls of the ministry, it felt like everyone was watching everyone else a little more closely. There was no official memo about the tape, no staff meeting to clear the air. That wasn't how the Swaggarts operated. Instead, the leadership handled it through quiet conversations in offices with the blinds drawn, and hallway talks where the tone was low and deliberate. The fewer people involved, the better. Still, whispers have a way of traveling faster than sermons. One of the sound technicians, a man who had been with the ministry for over 15 years, told a CO worker in confidence that he'd been asked to double-check the archives. The instructions were vague, to make sure no unreleased footage or stray audio could be accessed by anyone outside of the approved team. He wasn't told why, but he didn't have to ask. Everyone knew. The tape had made people paranoid. Even some of the on-air personalities seemed slightly more measured in their conversations, where once they would linger in the green room laughing and swapping stories, now they kept things short, often disappearing into their offices between programs. The atmosphere had shifted from easy familiarity to cautious professionalism. Frances noticed it too. She had a way of quietly reading the temperature of a room without saying a word. Though she kept her public focus on ministry work, she was privately asking trusted friends to keep their ears open. She wasn't hunting for scandal, but she needed to know whether the unrest was dying down or growing roots. Meanwhile, the online conversation had split into two camps. On one side were Donnie's loyal supporters. They took his broadcast as the final word on the matter, dismissing the tape as a distraction from the gospel. Some even framed it as an attack from the devil, designed to weaken the ministry's work at a critical moment in its history. On the other side were those who didn't believe the statement answered enough. They asked why the woman's voice on the tape sounded so much like Paula White's, and why Donnie hadn't addressed her name directly. For them, the lack of denial was as telling as any admission. The person who had originally leaked the audio remained silent. No interviews, no follow-up posts, no further evidence. It was as if they had vanished, or been made to vanish. Then, one afternoon, a meeting was held in a small conference room on the second floor of the administration building. The blinds were closed. Only a handful of people were present: Donnie, Frances, Gabriel, and two senior advisors. Gabriel had been the most publicly quiet of all, but behind closed doors he had questions. "Dad," he said carefully, "you've addressed it publicly, but internally, this can't just be left hanging. People are talking. Some of them are uneasy." Donnie leaned back in his chair, his hands folded. "And what would you have me do? Call a press conference? Drag Paula's name into this and make it 10 times bigger? I've said my piece. That's all I'm going to say." Frances sat still, listening. Her voice, when it came, was measured. The public side is one thing, but here, in this ministry, everyone has to be on the same page. If you're saying it's innocent, then we need to make sure everyone here understands that, without question. They agreed, reluctantly, to a quiet internal briefing. Not an all-staff meeting, but a series of small gatherings where department heads could hear Donnie's words directly and carry that message back to their teams. It was an old-fashioned way of controlling the narrative, but it had worked for the Swaggarts before. In those briefings, Donnie kept his tone steady. He acknowledged the rumors, called them unfounded, and asked for unity. He spoke about trust, about standing together as a ministry family. And, perhaps most tellingly, he reminded them all that outside voices will always try to divide what God has built. It seemed to work, at least on the surface. The whispers grew quieter, the questions became less frequent, but not everyone was convinced. A few weeks later, a longtime donor requested a private lunch with Francis. Over a simple meal, they expressed concern about what's been going on lately. They didn't accuse, they didn't demand answers, but they wanted reassurance that the ministry's moral foundation was intact. Francis listened patiently, thanked them for their support, and assured them that the ministry's mission remained unchanged. Her ability to calm troubled waters had not faded with age. Still, after the meeting, she sat alone in her office for a long time, staring out the window. She knew that in their world, perception mattered almost as much as reality. And once a seed of doubt had been planted, even if it was unfounded, it could grow in unexpected ways. For Donnie, life returned to a cautious normal. He kept preaching, kept traveling for select revival meetings, and kept his interactions, especially those outside the ministry, shorter, less casual. Every word felt like it could be recorded. Every private conversation carried the risk of being taken out of context. And somewhere out there, that tape still existed, untouched, unedited, waiting. No one knew if it would surface again. No one knew if more existed, if other conversations had been captured, if other voices might one day be recognized. But Donnie knew one thing with certainty. If it happened once, it could happen again. And next time, there might be no way to explain it away.